I was gonna get the diaper and somebody said, "Hola." And I didn't see nothing since. I woke up right here on the floor and I didn't see Matt.
The desperate search for a 7-month-old boy who was reported kidnapped in Southern California has taken a dark turn after his parents were arrested under suspicion of murder. Now, Friday, August 22nd, Jake and Rebecca Haro were arrested for murder just over 1 week after their child went missing. Police stormed the murder suspect's Cabazon home and cuffed the disheveled and eerily emotionless couple before being separately hauled off.
Cuffed alongside San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputies and cadaver dogs near brush just off the 60 freeway by Gilman Springs Road on Sunday, a remote field here in Moreno Valley about 10 miles south of where baby Emmanuel was initially reported missing in Yucaipa.
You'd think a father pleading guilty to murdering his 7-month-old son would be the end of the story. But in the case of baby Emmanuel Haro, a confession didn't bring closure. It just exposed a terrifying void. While Jake Haro sits in prison as an admitted killer, his wife is still in a cell, clinging to a bizarre story about a parking lot kidnapping. And the baby, still nowhere to be found. So, how did a known child abuser manipulate the system to walk free and kill again? What I'm about to walk you through isn't internet rumor. I've pieced this together from court transcripts, official DA press releases, and the cold, hard facts of a system that failed a child who never stood a chance. So, why am I here? Why did I decide to pull these files, watch hours of interrogation tapes, and dig into a case that, on the surface, looks like it's already been solved? I mean, we have a guilty plea now. We have a father behind bars. But the reason I couldn't just scroll past this story, the reason it kept me up at night, isn't just the brutality of it. It's the audacity. It's the sheer confidence of two people who looked a camera in the eye and tried to sell the world a screenplay instead of the truth. I'm talking about the disappearance of 7-month-old Emmanuel Haro, and to really understand why this case is such a mess of lies and failures, we have to go back to the beginning. Not to the courtroom where Jake Haro cried, but to a parking lot in Yucaipa, California. August 14th. The story starts the way a lot of our worst nightmares do. You have a frantic mother, Rebecca Haro, and a father, Jake Haro, standing in front of news cameras. They aren't polished. They aren't prepped by PR teams. In fact, when the sheriff's office first put video of them online, they were being walked out of their home in pajamas and boxers. They looked raw. They looked vulnerable. And in those first few hours, that vulnerability makes you want to believe them. It makes you want to help. And the story they told, it was terrifying. Rebecca claimed she was at a Big 5 sporting goods store. It was evening. She said she needed to change Emmanuel's diaper, so she laid him down, presumably in or near the car. And that's when the world supposedly went black. She told reporters and police that a woman approached her and said one word, "Holla?" That's it? Hola? And then, according to Rebecca, she was attacked. She said she was knocked to the ground, and by the time she came to, her baby boy was gone. Just like that. Snarled from a public parking lot while his mother lay unconscious on the pavement. Now, pause for a second. This is a terrifying narrative. It plays on every parent's deepest fear that you can turn your head for a split second, or just try to take care of your child's basic needs, and a predator is waiting in the shadows. And because of that fear, the community responded exactly how you'd expect. People rallied. We're talking about search parties, flyers, strangers coming out in droves because they saw a mother in pain. We saw images of Jake Haro pleading, saying, "Whoever took our son, please give him back." It was emotional. It was heavy. You had people driving out to the desert, drone operators like JP's Mysteries and Adventures flying over vast stretches of land, trying to spot a car seat or a bundle of blankets. But, at the same time, while the community was out there sweating in the California heat, looking for this little boy, law enforcement was doing something else. They were watching the parents. And this is where things start to feel off. See, when you look at Rebecca in those early interviews, she's sporting a black eye. It's nasty. It's a visible, purple and yellow bruise right on her face. And in the context of her story, that bruise is her receipt. It's the physical proof that she fought for her son, that she was assaulted. She pointed to it as if to say, "Look, I'm a victim too." But detectives are trained to look past the emotion, and they started noticing details that didn't fit the script. The problem is, bruises tell time. If you've ever been in a fight or had an injury, you know a fresh blow doesn't look like a week-old healing wound. And sources began whispering almost immediately that Rebecca's black eye didn't look fresh. It looked like it had been healing for a good amount of time. In fact, it eventually came to light that she reportedly had that black eye nearly 2 weeks before she ever called 911 to report the abduction. Which means, if she had that bruise 2 weeks ago, who gave it to her? And why use an old injury to back up a new lie? This is the first crack in the foundation. And once you see that crack, you start looking at everything else differently. You start looking at the timeline. Rebecca claimed they were at the sporting goods store after attending a football game for their other son. It sounds like a wholesome family evening, right? Football game, quick stop at the store, tragedy strikes. It establishes a timeline where Emmanuel is alive and well, out in public, just hours before he vanishes. But here is where the story completely falls apart. Investigators and reporters started talking to people who were at that football game, and guess what? It's been reported that people didn't see Emmanuel there. Not in the stands. Not in the car. Not with his parents. So, if he wasn't at the game, where was he? And this brings me to something that really stops you cold. We assume, when a parent reports a child missing, that the child was with them right up until that moment. We assume the missing clock starts at the 911 call. But true crime blogger Annie Elise reported that, according to people she spoke with, it had been at least a month since anyone had actually seen Emmanuel. Think about that, a month. So, I have to ask you guys this, because it's something I struggle to wrap my head around. If a baby hasn't been seen for a month, no doctors, no family friends, no one at a football game, and then suddenly the parents claim a stranger took him in a parking lot. Do you think that's just a panic move to cover up an accident? Or does that level of planning tell you something much darker was going on the whole time? Let me know what you think. Because that is the question that changes everything. If Emmanuel wasn't at the football game, and if that black eye was weeks old, then the scene at the Big Five wasn't a crime scene. It was a stage. What I found was that law enforcement caught on to this faster than the public did. While we were sharing flyers, they were serving search warrants. Within days of that tearful plea, police were at the Haro home in a rural part of Southern California, hauling out bags of evidence. They weren't looking for a kidnapper anymore. They were looking for traces of a baby who might not have even made it to the parking lot. The facade of the grieving parents was crumbling, but even then, standing there in their pajamas, looking lost, Jake and Rebecca held the line. They were a unified front. They sat next to each other. They cried together. But unity in a lie is a fragile thing. All it takes is for one person to blink, or, in Jake Haro's case, for one person to try and save their own skin. Because while Rebecca was sticking to her story about the hola lady, Jake was about to take a very different kind of trip with detectives. And that trip would reveal just how cold this case was about to get. So, the police have a grieving mother with a black eye and a father pleading for his son's return. On the surface, it's a tragedy. But in an investigation, you don't look at the surface, you look for the cracks. And in the case of Emmanuel Haro, those cracks didn't just appear, they were gaping wide open from the very first moment Rebecca Haro opened her mouth. Let's really look at the hola story. Rebecca claimed that while she was changing Emmanuel's diaper in the parking lot, a woman approached her, said hola, and then everything went black. The next thing she knew, she was on the ground, and Emmanuel was gone. Now, kidnappings by strangers do happen, but they are rare. And stranger abductions where the perpetrator knocks out the mother, takes only the infant, leaves the mother alive, and vanishes without a trace in a public commercial parking lot. That is statistically microscopic. The first major red flag was the injury itself. That black eye. When Rebecca appeared on camera, that bruise was the visual anchor of her story. It was the proof that she had fought, or at least that she had been victimized. But detectives aren't just looking at the injury, they are looking at the age of the injury. And almost immediately, law enforcement noticed that the bruise on her face didn't look like it happened the night before. It looked like it had been healing for a significant amount of time. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't swollen in the way a knockout punch would be less than 24 hours later. It was fading. And then, the information started to trickle in that shattered her timeline completely. Reports surfaced that Rebecca actually had that black eye nearly 2 weeks before she ever called law enforcement to report the abduction. Think about the implication of that. She didn't just lie about how she got the bruise. She repurposed an old injury likely from a domestic incident or an accident that happened weeks prior and used it as a prop in a staged kidnapping. She pointed to a healing wound and told the world it was fresh. That takes a level of calculation that is hard to reconcile with a grieving mother in shock. This is the part that really gets to me. If you are a mother and your baby is genuinely missing, why would you lie about your own injury? Do you think she used that old bruise because she was terrified of the police finding out the truth? Or do you think she was trying to hide abuse that was already happening at home? I want to know your take on this. Was this panic, or was this a plan? Because if the black eye was a lie, then the assault was a lie. And if the assault was a lie, the Hola woman never existed. But the inconsistencies didn't stop at her face. They extended to the baby's entire existence in those final days. Remember, Rebecca's story relied on a very specific sequence of events. They went to a football game for their older son, then they went to the Big Five store, and then the kidnapping happened. It paints a picture of a family outing. But when investigators started pulling on that thread, the sweater unraveled. It has been reported that people who were at that football game didn't see Emmanuel. Witnesses saw the parents. They saw the older sibling. But the baby? No one could recall seeing him there. Which begs the question, was he ever in the car that night? And this leads us to the most chilling discrepancy of all. While Rebecca was telling police the baby was taken on August 14th, sources close to the investigation and local bloggers began reporting that it had been at least a month since anyone had actually seen Emmanuel alive. A month. That means for potentially 30 days, this child was unaccounted for, and his parents were living their lives, going to football games, and walking around town. The kidnapping wasn't the beginning of the crime. It was likely the end of the cover-up. And speaking of cover-ups, there is one detail that I found particularly damning. It wasn't just that their story didn't make sense in the moment. It's that they appeared to have rehearsed the location. It has been reported that the Haros were in that exact same Big Five parking lot in Yucaipa weeks before the night Rebecca says she was attacked. But they weren't shopping. Allegedly, the couple asked employees of that sporting goods store where their security cameras were located. At the time, they claimed their car had been broken into, so they wanted to check the footage or camera angles. But looking back now, that looks a lot less like a car break-in victim and a lot more like someone casing a location. They were checking the blind spots. They were figuring out exactly where they could stage a crime without being seen by the digital eyes that watch everything. That isn't panic. That is premeditation. Law enforcement saw through this almost immediately. In the hours and days after the story was first told, investigators found these inconsistencies in what Rebecca was saying. They didn't just nod and take notes. They confronted her. They essentially asked her, "Why is your eye already healing? Why didn't anyone see the baby at the game?" And that is when the grieving mother act stopped. According to reports, once they confronted her about the holes in her story, she stopped cooperating with the investigation. She shut down. So, within days, we went from a public manhunt for a mysterious kidnapper to a laser focus on the parents. The police knew the Hola story was garbage. They knew the timeline was fake. And they knew that whatever happened to Emmanuel, it didn't happen in that parking lot. But knowing they lied is one thing. Knowing what they were hiding is something else entirely. Because if Emmanuel wasn't taken by a stranger, and if he wasn't with them at the football game, then we are left with the dark reality that something happened to him long before they ever dialed 911. And to understand what that something might be, we have to look at who Jake Haro really is. Because this wasn't the first time a child had suffered under his roof. And the system that was supposed to protect Emmanuel had already let him down once before. So, we have a couple lying about a kidnapping. We have a timeline that doesn't make sense. And we have a police force that stopped looking for a stranger and started digging into the parents. But to really understand the danger Emmanuel was in probably from the day he was born, you have to look away from the parking lot in Ucapa and look back in time. This is where it gets dark, because as investigators started peeling back the layers of Jake Haro's life, they didn't find a clean slate. They found a pattern. It turns out, Emmanuel wasn't the first child to suffer under Jake's care. He wasn't even the first infant. In 2018, Jake Haro was arrested for willful child cruelty. The victim in that case was his own daughter. She was just 10 weeks old. Now, I want you to really process that age. 10 weeks. A baby that age can't crawl, can't walk, can't provoke anyone. They are completely helpless. And the injuries this little girl sustained are the stuff of nightmares. According to an affidavit from that case, this 10-week-old baby was sent to the hospital with fractured ribs. But it wasn't just one break, it was a catalog of abuse. The court records listed an acute fracture of the posterior left rib and healing fractures of the 6th, 7th, 10th, 11th, and 12th ribs. Healing fractures. That phrase is devastating. It means this wasn't a one-time accident. It means she was hurt, her body tried to knit itself back together, and then she was hurt again. But the list goes on. She had a partial bone fracture of the skull. She had a brain hemorrhage. She had significant swelling in the soft tissue of her neck. Whatever happened in that house in 2018 left that little girl broken. True crime blogger Abby Blavey spoke to the adoptive mother of that child, who is now 7 years old, and the update is heartbreaking. This little girl is blind. She cannot speak. She has permanent damage including cerebral palsy, all allegedly because of what her father did to her when she was just a newborn. And yet, despite this history of extreme violence, Jake Haro was walking free. But here is the part that really messes with your head. It's not just that he hurt a child, it's how he managed to convince the world around him that he was fixed. During his probation for that case, Jake was required to take parenting and child abuse classes. You would think that someone capable of fracturing a baby's skull would be flagged as a danger, right? The thing is, Jake Haro is a chameleon. Reports from his counselors painted a picture of a man who was reforming. One counselor, Stephen Day, wrote as recently as July 2024, just a month before Emmanuel vanished, that Jake was attentive, polite, and appropriately interactive. He noted that Jake appeared to have gained self-insight into his parenting style. Another counselor, M.A. Johnson, reported back in 2023 that Jake described his discipline methods as relying on logical and natural consequences and using positive reinforcement. Based on her assessment, she concluded that Jake's likelihood of abusing a child was low. Low. He even earned a perfect score 7 out of 7 in the category of child abuse in his class. This honestly chills me to the bone. You have a guy who nearly killed a baby getting a perfect score in a class about not abusing kids. It makes me wonder, do these mandated classes actually change behavior? Or do they just teach abusers exactly what to say to fool the system? I really want to hear your thoughts on this. Is it rehabilitation? Or is it just a masterclass in manipulation? Because that is what we are seeing here. We are seeing a man who learned the language of the system. He knew how to nod, how to smile, and how to say the right buzzwords like positive reinforcement to get the counselors off his back. He played the part of the reformed dad perfectly. And there is another pattern here that we can't ignore. Back in 2018, when he was first confronted about his daughter's injuries, Jake didn't immediately own up to it. The detective noted in the probable cause affidavit that Jake came into the police station a couple of times and tried to shift the blame. He reportedly told them he couldn't imagine it at first, but he became convinced it was the baby's mother. He tried to sell her out. He tried to paint himself as the oblivious, innocent father and the mother as the monster. Does that sound familiar? Fast forward to 2025. What did we see in the Big 5 parking lot? We saw Jake standing next to Rebecca, letting her tell a story about a hola woman, letting her take the heat for the inconsistencies. And later, when he was out in the field with detectives, it looked like he was trying to cut a deal, trying to separate himself from his wife's narrative. He is a man who knows how to survive. He knows how to deflect. And he knows that if he plays the victim, or at least the good guy, he might just slip through the cracks again. But the tragedy is that the warning signs weren't just red flags, they were flashing neon lights. You had a baby with a brain hemorrhage in 2018. You had a father who blamed everyone else. And you had a system that looked at him and said, he seems polite. He's low risk. And because of that assessment, because of that ability to manipulate the people who were supposed to be watching him, Jake Haro was left in charge of another infant. He was free. He was rehabilitated. And 7 months ago, he was entrusted with the life of Emmanuel Haro. The ghost of that 2018 case hangs over everything in this investigation. It explains the violence. It explains the deception. But it doesn't explain why he was out on the streets in the first place. For that, we have to look higher up the food chain. We have to look at a courtroom decision that many are now calling an outrageous error in judgment. Because Jake Haro didn't escape justice alone. He had help, and that help came from a judge who decided that a man who crushed a baby's ribs deserved a break. So, we have a man who broke the ribs and skull of a 10-week-old baby. We have a reformed dad who learned to say the right things to counselors. But counselors don't decide who walks free and who goes to prison. Judges do. And this is where the story of Emmanuel Haro shifts from a tragedy of individual violence to a tragedy of systemic failure. Because Jake Haro didn't escape his past by running away. He walked right out the front door of the courthouse, with the permission of the state. In 2023, Jake stood before Superior Court Judge Dwight Moore. At this point, the court knew exactly what he had done to his daughter. They had the medical records. They knew she was permanently disabled. Prosecutors from the district attorney's office were in that courtroom, and they were pushing for prison time. They argued, on the record, that this was a prison case. But Judge Moore saw it differently. Instead of locking him up, the judge decided to show mercy. He handed down a suspended sentence. Basically, he gave Jake probation and 180 days of a work release program, which District Attorney Mike Hestron later described as ending up being like community service. And then, the judge said something that, looking back now, makes your stomach turn. According to court transcripts, Judge Moore told Jake Haro, "I'm giving you a chance. Don't mess it up. Good luck. Good luck." He wished a child abuser good luck. And Jake, he responded with a polite, "Thank you. I have to stop here because this moment is the turning point of everything." A judge looks at a man who destroyed an infant's life and decides he deserves a second chance. Do you think the judge was trying to be compassionate, or is this a gross negligence of duty? And honestly, who do you blame more for Emmanuel's death? Jake for committing the crime, or the judge for letting him out to do it? Let me know in the comments. The problem is, that second chance wasn't Jake's to take. It was a gamble with the safety of any future child who crossed his path, and we know who lost that bet. District Attorney Mike Hestron didn't mince words after Emmanuel disappeared. It is rare for a DA to publicly attack a sitting judge, but Hestron was furious. He went on camera and called the judge's decision an outrageous error in judgment. He didn't stop there. He said plainly, if that judge had done his job as he should have done, Emmanuel would be alive today. That is a heavy accusation. He isn't just saying the system made a mistake, he is saying the system is an accessory to this crime. And this is important. It's not like Jake was a model citizen after that. Good luck. Wish. In 2024, while he was still on that probation, he was arrested again. This time for being a fill-on in possession of a firearm. Now, usually, if you are on probation for nearly killing a kid, and you get caught with a gun, you go straight to jail. That suspended prison sentence the judge warned him about. It should have slammed down on him like a hammer. But it didn't. What I found was a bureaucratic nightmare. His probation violation hearings were postponed. Not once, not twice, but 5 times. The system just kept kicking the can down the road. They let him post bail. They let him walk out again. So you have a judge who was too lenient, and then a probation system that was too slow. It was a perfect storm of apathy. What struck me here was the sheer lack of urgency. You have a violent offender with a gun, and the courts are just rescheduling dates on a calendar. It feels like nobody was actually looking at him. They were just processing paperwork. And while they were shuffling files, Jake Haro was at home, in a rural house in Cabazon, with a new baby named Emmanuel. The reason this matters is that we often think of true crime as a battle between good guys and bad guys, cops versus killers. But in Emmanuel's case, the good guys, the people paid to protect the innocent, literally opened the door for the bad guy. Judge Moore said he wanted to give Jake a chance so he wouldn't mess it up. Well, Jake didn't just mess it up. He allegedly murdered the very next child he was entrusted with. So now we have a timeline that is infuriatingly clear. 2018, Jake abuses his daughter. 2023, Judge Moore gives him a break. 2024, he gets caught with a gun but stays free. August 2025, Emmanuel vanishes. The system didn't just fail Emmanuel. It handed him over to his executioner. But even with all this history, even with the police finally realizing who they were dealing with, there was still one missing piece of the puzzle. The body. Jake was in custody. Rebecca was in custody. But where was the baby? And that is when Jake Haro decided to take the detectives on a field trip. He claimed he was ready to help. He claimed he could lead them to Emmanuel. But as search teams would soon find out, trusting Jake Haro is a game you can never win. So, the system failed. Jake Haro was out on the streets when he should have been locked up. But once the handcuffs finally clicked onto his wrists in August 2025, the dynamic changed. He wasn't the grieving father anymore. He was a suspect. And usually, when suspects get caught in a lie this big, they have one card left to play, the location of the body. This brings us to one of the most surreal and disturbing moments of this entire investigation. In late August, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department made a move. They took Jake Haro out of his jail cell. They put him in an orange jumpsuit, shackled his hands and feet, and drove him out to the Badlands near Moreno Valley and Gilman Springs Road. Now, if you know this area of Southern California, you know it's unforgiving. It's dry, it's hilly, and in August, the heat is absolutely blistering. The premise was simple. Jake claimed he was ready to talk. He claimed he could show detectives exactly where he left Emmanuel. The media caught wind of this, and the footage is haunting. You see this convoy of police SUVs parked on the side of a dusty road. You see detectives walking with Jake. He's pointing. He's looking around. At times, he looks confused. At other times, he looks like he's crying. For a moment, everyone held their breath. The news crews, the online sleuths, the community. We all thought, okay, this is it. We're bringing him home today. Search and rescue teams were deployed. We're talking about cadaver dogs, drones buzzing overhead, and lines of officers combing through brush and dirt. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, but they had the guy who supposedly built the haystack standing right there. But hours passed, then days, and nothing. They found absolutely nothing. This is where you have to stop and ask yourself what game Jake Haro was playing. Because there are only two real possibilities here, and both of them are sickening. The first possibility is that he genuinely forgot. Maybe in the panic of the crime, assuming it was an accidental death covered up by panic, he drove out there in the dark, dumped his son, and honestly couldn't find the spot again in the harsh light of day. The terrain out there looks the same in every direction. It's just dirt and scrub brush. But there is a second possibility, and frankly, it's the one that makes more sense to me. Was this just a field trip? Think about it. You're in a jail cell. It's loud, it's dangerous, and you have no control. Suddenly, you offer a location, and you get a ride in an air-conditioned SUV. You get to walk outside. You get attention. You get to feel like the most important person in the room again. I need to hear your take on this, because it divides everyone I talk to. Do you think Jake Haro genuinely lost track of where he left his son's body? Or was he dragging the police out into the desert, just to get a few hours of fresh air and manipulate the cops one last time? Let me know, is he confused, or is he cruel? Because here is the thing about the search area. Private investigator Steve Pfizer, who was following the case closely, made a really astute observation. He noted that Jake and Rebecca didn't strike him as avid outdoors people. They weren't hikers. They weren't in great physical shape. Which means, if they were going to dispose of a body, they probably weren't hiking 2 miles up a steep ridge to do it. They would likely do what most panic-stricken criminals do: the path of least resistance, a roadside ditch, an irrigation tunnel, somewhere accessible from the car. The fact that the police didn't find Emmanuel near the road suggests that maybe he was never there at all. And that leads to a chilling realization. While Jake was out there pointing at hills and wasting resources, the clock was ticking on the real location. See, while everyone was looking at the dirt, investigators started looking at the data. And the data was telling a different story. If Jake was lying about the location, he was doing it to buy time or to distract from the truth. And usually, when a killer leads police on a wild goose chase, it's because the actual disposal site is somewhere they desperately don't want you to look. Or, worse, it's somewhere that has already been destroyed. The search near Highway 60 was a failure. But it wasn't a total loss. It proved that Jake Haro couldn't be trusted, even when he was pretending to cooperate. It proved that his tears, those same tears he cried in court, were weaponized. The detectives packed up. The dogs were put back in their crates. Jake was driven back to his cell. And Emmanuel was still missing. But as the dust settled on that failed search, a new theory began to emerge. It didn't involve hills or hiking trails. It involved something much more mundane and much more horrifying. Detectives began retracing the couple's movements not just on the night of the fake kidnapping, but in the days before. And they started noticing stops. Stops at commercial dumpsters. Stops that suggest Emmanuel wasn't left somewhere to be found. He was discarded. So, while we were all staring at the mountains waiting for a miracle, the evidence suggests that Emmanuel might have already been moved to a place where recovery is nearly impossible. This brings us to the most difficult part of the investigation: the digital trail that led away from the desert and straight toward the landfill. So, the physical search in the desert was a bust. The dogs didn't alert, the drones didn't spot anything, and Jake Haro was hauled back to his cell, leaving investigators with nothing but dust on their boots. But while Jake was playing tour guide in the Badlands, a different team of investigators was sitting in an air-conditioned room, staring at screens. And they were finding something much more valuable than a random patch of dirt. They were finding the truth. In modern investigations, you can lie to the press, you can lie to your family, and you can even lie to the police. But you cannot lie to your phone. And you certainly cannot lie to the surveillance grid. What I found was that the digital footprint of Jake and Rebecca Haro told a story that was radically different from the one they told on the news. Let's go back to the Big Five sporting goods store. Remember, this was supposed to be the scene of the crime. Rebecca claimed she was attacked there. Jake claimed he was a grieving father waiting for his wife. But when police pulled the security footage from that location, they didn't just look at the night of August 14th. They rewound the tape, and what they found was chilling. It has been reported that weeks before the alleged kidnapping, the couple had visited that exact store. But they weren't shopping for sneakers or camping gear. Allegedly, they were asking employees about the security cameras. They wanted to know where the blind spots were. They used a cover story, something about their car being broken into previously, to get information on where the cameras were pointed. Think about the level of premeditation there. They were casing the location. They were scouting a stage for their performance. This wasn't a panic decision made in the heat of the moment after an accidental death. This suggests they had a plan. They knew exactly where to park and exactly where to stand, so that the hola lady wouldn't be seen because she didn't exist. But the digital evidence didn't stop at the store. It followed them. Police obtained warrants for their cell phone data and vehicle GPS. And this is where the timeline of the football game completely disintegrated. Instead of a wholesome family outing, The data reportedly showed a series of movements that looked suspicious. Specifically, investigators began looking at stops the couple made at commercial dumpsters. This is the detail that turns your stomach. If you have a sick child, you go to a hospital. If you have a deceased child and you are grieving, you call 911. But if you are stopping at dumpsters in the middle of the night, you are treating a human being like refuse. This led to the prevailing theory that tragically, Emmanuel wasn't buried in the desert at all. The working theory among prosecutors, and the reason the search has been so difficult, is that his little body was placed in a trash receptacle. If that is true, it means he was likely taken by a waste management truck and deposited in the Lamb Canyon landfill. Now, I want to explain why this is a nightmare for investigators. A landfill isn't just a pile of trash. It is an active, shifting landscape. Waste is compacted under massive weight. It is buried under tons of soil daily. If Emmanuel was placed there days or even weeks before the kidnapping was reported, the chances of recovering him are close to zero. I have to pause here because this is the hardest part of the case to digest. We are talking about a father treating his own son like garbage, literally. Do you think a parent can do this just out of fear of getting caught? Or does it take a specific kind of evil to throw your own baby away in a dumpster? I want to know if you think this was panic or pure sociopathy. The realization that Emmanuel was likely in a landfill changed everything. It meant that while the community was putting up flyers, the evidence was being buried under tons of debris. But for Jake and Rebecca, the walls were closing in fast. On Friday morning, just a few days after their tearful press conference, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department made their move. They didn't call and ask the couple to come in for a follow-up. They went to the house. The arrest footage is something you need to see to understand their mindset. When the deputies arrived, Jake and Rebecca were walked out of their home in handcuffs. But look at what they are wearing. They are in pajamas. Jake is in his boxers. The thing is, this tells us they were comfortable. They were sleeping. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought the whole story was holding up. They thought the community was still looking for a kidnapper. There is a striking contrast between the couple we saw on TV clinging to each other, crying, begging for help, and the couple being led to the police cruisers. In the arrest video, the performance is gone. They look small. They look confused. The mask had officially slipped. They were booked on suspicion of murder. And just like that, the grieving parents' narrative was dead. The police announced to the world that there was no kidnapper. There was no Hola lady. There was only Jake and Rebecca. But even in handcuffs, the drama wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Because usually, when couples commit a crime together, they stick together until the pressure gets too high. As they sat in separate interrogation rooms, and later in separate cells, the unified front began to crack. Jake knew what he had done. He knew about the dumpsters. He knew about the casing of the store. And he had a decision to make. Was he going to go down for everything? Or was he going to try to salvage what was left of his life? The digital evidence had caught them. The casing footage had exposed them. And the dumpster stops had condemned them in the eyes of the public. But the question remained, who actually killed Emmanuel? And was one of them willing to turn on the other to save themselves? That brings us to the split. The moment where the husband and wife stopped being partners in crime and started being defendants in a murder trial. And trust me, looking at how they handled the aftermath, love had nothing to do with it.
Negative K, nothing further, just see the cabbie on the corner.
So, the digital evidence had buried them. The GPS placed them at dumpsters. The security footage proved they were casing the store. The whole story was exposed as a lie. But getting caught is only the first act of the legal drama. The second act is where things get really ugly. It's the part where the "it's against the world" mentality usually shatters into me against you. We call this the prisoner's dilemma. Two people commit a crime. They promise to stick to the script. But once they are in separate cells, staring at four walls and a potential life sentence, paranoia sets in. You start wondering, is he talking? Is she cutting a deal? And in the case of Jake and Rebecca Haro, The split wasn't just legal. It was psychological. What we saw in the weeks following their arrest was a bizarre study in contrasts. On one side, you had Jake. He was quiet. He had been through the system before. He knew that the police didn't need a confession to convict him, they had the data. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation instantly. On the other side, you had Rebecca. Even from behind bars, Rebecca kept talking. She gave interviews. She continued to cry. And most shockingly, she continued to stick to the kidnapping story. Even when the police said, "We know you were at the dumpsters," and "We know about the bruises," she maintained her innocence. This is where the case becomes incredibly polarizing. There is a school of thought that looks at Rebecca and sees a victim. They see a woman who was battered, manipulated, and terrified of her husband. We know Jake was abusive. He nearly killed his previous child. Is it possible that Rebecca was so controlled by him, so deep in the cycle of abuse, that she was psychologically incapable of breaking the script he wrote for her? Was she suffering from a form of Stockholm syndrome, protecting her tormentor even when he was in handcuffs? But then, there is the other side. The side that looks at the video of her casing the store. The side that remembers she waited weeks to report her child missing. That isn't fear. That's participation. That is a mother who, regardless of her husband's influence, made a conscious choice to prioritize a lie over her son's life. This is the debate that tears this community apart. Do you see Rebecca as a mastermind who helped plan the cover-up? Or do you see her as another one of Jake's victims who was too scared to tell the truth? I really want to know where you draw the line between victimhood and complicity. While Rebecca was publicly spiraling, their legal paths were diverging. In the courtroom, they were no longer sitting together holding hands. They were seated on opposite sides of the aisle. They had separate attorneys, and in the legal world, separate attorneys mean separate survival strategies. It became clear that Jake's lawyer and Rebecca's lawyer were playing two different games. Rebecca's defense was likely going to be, "I didn't do it. I was a victim. I believed my husband." It's the only card she had left. But Jake didn't have that luxury. He was the one with the prior conviction for child cruelty. He was the one with the history of violence. He knew that if this went to trial, a jury would look at his 2018 case, look at the missing body of Emmanuel, and they wouldn't just convict him, they would bury him. At this point, I think Jake realized that the unified front was actually a sinking ship. If he kept lying, he was going down for first-degree murder. He was looking at life without parole. But if he changed his strategy, maybe, just maybe, he could control the outcome one last time. Before I tell you about the move Jake made next, a move that shocked everyone in that courtroom, I want to take a second to ask you to subscribe to the channel. We are digging into cases that expose the cracks in our system, just like this one, and your support helps me keep doing this research. So, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's get back to the case. The tension in the courtroom during these pre-trial hearings was thick. You could feel it. You had families watching, hoping for answers. You had Rebecca rocking back and forth, sobbing, looking at Jake. And you had Jake, stone-faced, likely calculating the math of his sentence. The whole story was dead. The community knew it. The police knew it. The only person still trying to keep it alive was Rebecca. And that is what makes what happened next so dramatic. Usually, in cases like this, you expect months of delays. You expect years of pre-trial motions. You expect a long, drawn-out fight where the defense tries to suppress the dumpster evidence or argue about the GPS data. But Jake Haro decided to skip the script. He didn't wait for a trial. He didn't wait to see if Rebecca would crack and testify against him. He did something that criminals almost never do unless they have absolutely no other option. He decided to end the charade. And in doing so, he didn't just seal his own fate, he completely isolated Rebecca. He left her alone on an island of lies, clutching a story that her own partner was about to admit was total fiction. The split was complete. The couple that lied together would not be staying together. And as the court date for the felony settlement conference approached, nobody, not the press, not the families, and certainly not Rebecca, was ready for what Jake was about to say to the judge. So, everyone was bracing for a long fight. We expected months of legal maneuvering, suppression hearings, and the usual slow grind of the justice system. The date was October 16, 2025. The setting was the Riverside Hall of Justice. The event was supposed to be a felony settlement conference. Now, for those who don't speak, courtroom. A settlement conference is usually just lawyers talking in back rooms while the defendants sit there and wait. It's administrative. It's boring. But Jake Haro decided to go off script again. According to witnesses inside that courtroom, including a local resident named Don Cato who spoke to the press, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Jake wasn't sitting there stone-faced anymore. He was crying. And then, he did something that defense attorneys usually beg their clients not to do unless they have a rock-solid deal in place. He pleaded guilty. But he didn't just plead guilty to a lesser charge to get a lighter sentence. What happened next was highly unusual. Jake entered a plea to the court. In other words, he didn't cut a deal with the district attorney. The DA's office didn't offer him a reduced sentence in exchange for this. Jake simply looked at the charges: murder, assault on a child causing death, and filing a false police report, and said, essentially, I did it. All of it. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The shock in that courtroom was palpable. You have to remember, up until this exact second, there was technically a presumption of innocence. There was technically a missing child case. But the moment that word, guilty, left his mouth, the case transformed. It was no longer a mystery. It was a confirmed homicide. And looking at Rebecca Haro in that moment tells you everything about how chaotic this situation was. Witnesses described her as totally breaking down. She wasn't just crying, she was rocking back and forth in her chair, sobbing, repeating phrases like, my baby, my baby. I want to stop on Rebecca's reaction for a second, because it's really hard to interpret. She's watching her husband admit to killing their son. Do you think she was crying because she was grieving Emmanuel? Or was she crying because she realized her partner just threw in the towel and left her to face the music alone? Tell me how you read that emotion. The thing is, Jake's decision to plead, straight up, to the charges raises a massive question: why? Why would a man who spent weeks lying, who dragged cops out to the desert, and who staged a kidnapping, suddenly decide to own up to everything without even fighting for a lower sentence? There are a few theories here, and none of them are particularly noble. One theory is that Jake saw the evidence: the dumpsters, the GPS, the texts, and knew he was cooked. He knew that if this went to a jury trial, they would show photos of his previous daughter's injuries. They would paint him as a monster, and he would likely get life without parole. By pleading early, and by showing remorse, those tears in the courtroom, he might have been hoping for leniency from the judge. Remember, the system had been lenient with him before. Maybe he thought he could charm his way into another light sentence. Another theory is that he was trying to save Rebecca. By taking the fall entirely, by saying, I did this, he theoretically makes it harder for the prosecution to pin the actual murder on her. He becomes the villain, and she becomes the bystander. But legal experts watching the case noted something else. By pleading guilty, Jake shut down the need for a trial, which means the gruesome details of exactly how Emmanuel died might never fully come out in public. There won't be a medical examiner testifying to a jury about bone fractures. There won't be a reconstruction of the crime scene. By pleading guilty, Jake kept the darkest secrets of that house to himself. He controlled the narrative one last time. The judge accepted the plea. The date for sentencing was set for November 3rd. But for Rebecca, this was a disaster. Her legal team was likely preparing a defense based on reasonable doubt. They could have argued that maybe Emmanuel was kidnapped, or maybe it was an accident. But now, her husband just admitted it was murder. He admitted it was assault. Rebecca's attorney immediately asked for a continuance. They needed time to regroup. The whole story was now officially legally dead, even if Rebecca hadn't admitted it yet. What I found was that after this hearing, the split between them was final. Jake was moved to the sentencing phase. He was done fighting. Rebecca, however, was still in the ring. Her settlement conference was pushed back. She was left in legal limbo, still claiming she was innocent, while the man she shared a bed with had just confessed to being a killer. The confession was supposed to bring closure. That's what we always hear, right? Closure for the family. But in the case of Emmanuel Haro, Jake's guilty plea felt hollow. He admitted to the crime, yes. But there was one thing he still wasn't giving up, even as he stood there crying. Even as he admitted to second-degree murder, he did not tell the court where Emmanuel was. He didn't say, "I put him in this specific dumpster on this specific night." He didn't draw a map. He just said, "Guilty," and sat down. So, we have a confession, but we don't have a body. And without a body, the family can't have a funeral. As November 3rd approached, the community turned its eyes to Judge Gary Polk. The question wasn't whether Jake was guilty anymore. The question was, what is the price of a baby's life in Riverside County? And would this judge finally do what the last one failed to do? So, we finally reached the day of reckoning. November 3rd, the Riverside Hall of Justice. Usually, a sentencing hearing is the final chapter of a crime story. It's the moment where the judge slams the gavel, the bad guy gets handcuffed, and the credits roll. But in the case of Emmanuel Haro, the atmosphere wasn't one of victory. It was heavy. It was suffocating. Because even though everyone knew Jake Haro was going to prison, there was a ghost in the room. Emmanuel was still missing. When Judge Gary Polk took the bench, he wasn't just looking at a man who made a mistake. He was looking at a repeat offender. He was looking at a man who had already shattered the skull of one child and had now admitted to killing another. And this time, there would be no good luck wishes. There would be no suspended sentences. The sentence that Judge Polk handed down was calculated to ensure that Jake Haro wouldn't breathe free air for a very, very long time. Here is the breakdown. And this is important because it shows just how much the system wanted to correct its past errors. First, he got 25 years to life for the second-degree murder and assault on a child. That is the core sentence. But the judge didn't stop there. He added 6 years of prison time by reactivating the suspended sentence from the 2018 case involving his daughter. Then, he added another 8 months for the gun possession charge. And finally, 180 days for the false police report, the lie that started this whole circus. And here is the kicker: the judge ordered these sentences to be served consecutively. In other words, they are stacked. Jake has to finish one sentence before he starts the next. He is looking at a minimum of 31 years before he can even whisper the word parole. For a man in his early 30s, that is effectively a life sentence. He walked into that courtroom a young father, and if he ever walks out, he will be an old man who missed the entire prime of his life. But as the sentence was read, and as the bailiffs prepared to take him away, there was a deafening silence on the one topic that actually mattered. Jake accepted the time. He accepted the murderer label, but he refused to give up the location of his son. The problem is, this leaves the case in a state of permanent agony. Justice was served on paper, but it wasn't served on the ground. There is no gravesite for the family to visit. There is no death certificate that lists a proper time and place. Emmanuel is legally dead, but physically, he is just gone. And this brings us to the most disturbing question of the entire hearing. Why? Why would a man who is already going to prison for 30 years keep that secret? He has nothing left to lose, right? He already pleaded guilty. There is no trial to win. So why not give the family that final piece of peace? This is the part that keeps me up at night. Do you think Jake is keeping the body's location a secret because he's ashamed? Or do you think he's holding on to it like a bargaining chip, a get-out-of-jail-free card he hopes to trade in 20 or 30 years when he's up for parole? Tell me, is this shame or strategy? With Jake being led away to start his decades in a cell, the spotlight swung violently back to the person left standing in the wreckage, Rebecca Haro. While Jake's case is technically closed, Rebecca's is a gaping wound. She didn't plead guilty. She didn't cut a deal. And now, she is in the worst possible position a defendant can be in. Think about it. Her co-defendant, her husband, just admitted to the murder. That means the kidnapping defense is dead. You can't argue that a stranger took the baby when the father just admitted to killing him. Rebecca is now facing a trial where the empty chair next to her screams of guilt. Her settlement conference was pushed to January 2026, and then March. She is sitting in the Robert Presley Detention Center, watching the days tick by, knowing that the man she protected has already folded. Which means, the drama isn't over. It has just shifted characters. Jake is gone. He is a number in the state penitentiary system now. But the mystery of what happened in those final days, inside the Haro house, and exactly where Emmanuel ended up might now rest entirely on whether Rebecca decides to finally break her silence. Will she go down with the ship for a husband who already abandoned her? Or will she finally tell us where the baby is? As we wait for her trial, we are left with a hollow victory. The bad guy is in jail, but the baby isn't home. And for a true crime story, that is the hardest ending to accept. We want answers. We want a burial. Instead, we got a math equation of years and months, and a map with a giant question mark in the middle of it. So, here we are. The news trucks have packed up and left Riverside. The ribbons on the trees are fading in the sun. Jake Haro is officially inmate number whatever the state assigns him, and the hola lady has been exposed as a ghost story. On paper, the district attorney chalked this up as a win. They got a conviction. They got a confession. They closed the file on the murder of Emmanuel Haro. But at this point, I started questioning everything about what we call justice. What struck me the most as I went through these final documents wasn't the legal victory. It was the overwhelming silence that followed it. Usually, when I finish researching a case, there is a sense of an ending. You know who did it, you know why, and you know where the victim is resting. But here, I look at the photo of Emmanuel, that wide-eyed, innocent stare, and I can't reconcile it with the reality that his final resting place is likely beneath tons of compacted waste in a landfill. That isn't closure. That is a void. The system worked, eventually. But it worked too late. And this is the part I couldn't get past. This wasn't a freak accident that nobody saw coming. This was a slow-motion car crash that started years ago. The hard lesson here isn't about the dangers of parking lots or strangers. It's about the dangerous gamble of second chances. In our legal system, we all want to believe in redemption. We want to believe that a man who breaks his baby daughter's ribs in 2018 can take a few parenting classes, get a good luck from a judge, and become a loving father. It's a nice story. It makes us feel good about rehabilitation. But this case forces us to look at the ugly truth sometimes. Showing mercy to a predator is just signing a death warrant for their next victim. Judge Moore made a choice in 2023 to be lenient. He prioritized Jake's potential over a child's safety, and the result is that Emmanuel Haro never made it to his first birthday. The reason this matters is because this is happening in courtrooms every single day. Right now, somewhere in America, a judge is looking at a file, seeing a polite abuser who says all the right things, and deciding to let them go home. We have to ask ourselves, is the system designed to protect children, or is it designed to process adults? Because in this case, the process killed the child, and while Jake is gone, the story isn't finished. We still have Rebecca. This is where I really need you guys to weigh in, because her trial is coming up in March 2026. Rebecca is the last person left who might hold the key to where Emmanuel is. Do you think she is staying silent because she's still terrified of Jake, even with him in prison? Or do you think she's just as cold and calculated as he is, trying to save herself? Drop your thoughts in the comments, victim or villain. Let's talk about it. We can't just turn the page on this one. Not yet. Because a solved case implies a funeral. It implies a headstone. It implies that a mother or a grandmother has a place to go and weep. Emmanuel Haro doesn't have that. He is still out there, somewhere in the dark, alone. Jake Haro thinks he ended this by pleading guilty. He thinks he can serve his 30 years and maybe, just maybe, walk out one day as an old man. But he didn't end it. He just paused it. So, we leave this story not with a period, but with a question mark. We keep watching Rebecca's trial. We keep asking where the body is. And we keep reminding the system that good luck isn't a legal strategy, it's a failure. Emmanuel is still missing. And until the earth gives up its secrets, or until a conscience finally wakes up in a prison cell, this case remains an open wound. Thanks for walking this path with me. Stay safe, stay observant, and never stop asking questions. I'll see you in the next one.